Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. So big welcome to everybody. For those of us who are just joining for the first time, welcome to your first Learn Live session. We will go ahead and work through a few interactive exercises and really do a lot of collaboration, learn a lot about post-processing. However, with that said, we have about 84 people here today, which is awesome. And I see a lot of names, or a lot of familiar names. So for those who have joined us in past sessions, welcome back. As you know, this is always a ton of fun. I have a ton of fun running these. So with all that said, let's go ahead and dive in. As I mentioned, this is an interactive session. The majority of folks who join us end up working on the project alongside everybody. But that's totally fine if you just like to follow along. If you are planning, however, on joining us, or rather working on your own Unity project during this time, go ahead and download the project. I think last time I checked is just over a gig, so it's a little on the larger side. It's a really high quality asset. It's the Courtyard asset. So, all right. So who is that voice? Well, I'm the director of design and a Unity developer at Kairos XR, development agency and consulting group specializing in occupational training content. So we build virtual reality, augmented reality, and desktop 3D for occupational training. And joining us today, actually, I'm pretty sure most of the gentlemen here are joining us. I know for sure James is here. So hey, James, I think we heard you when you came in. But they'll be helping out on the question front. So if you have any questions in regards to post-processing, and again, today's focus is on post-processing, the post-processing stack, go ahead, drop it in the Q&A channel, and these guys here will get to the questions as soon as possible. A little background on them. They're all really great Unity developers. And the benefit of this session is that you have access to so many Unity developers to accelerate your learning process. So don't be shy with those questions or even comments. If you like, drop them in the chat. These guys will get there as soon as possible. And if for whatever reason we don't, we'll absolutely follow up. So what's going on today? Well, again, we have quite a few familiar names, but for those who are just joining us for the first time, this is typically the workflow that we follow. We always spend a little bit of housekeeping in the beginning, and then we dive into the challenges. We spend the majority of the session actually working together, and then we finish up a little wrap up and additional resources, how to continue your learning, and all that exciting stuff towards the end. And in the spirit of housekeeping, as mentioned, we have the Connect group. So Unity's social media platform, Connect, is an amazing ecosystem of resources and other developers, from experts, professionals, to those just getting started on Connect. So if you are interested in joining the community, participating in that community, go ahead and join. Follow that bit.ly link at the top there. And again, this is actually a typo. It shouldn't be cutscenes. It should be the post-processing challenge assets. But go ahead, if you'd like to participate today, go ahead and download those in this bit.ly link at the bottom here. And let me just check that chat really quick to make sure that everybody does, in fact, have that bit.ly link. Awesome. Thanks, James, for dropping that in. It looks like James will be distributing that link, so go ahead and check the chat for that package. Awesome. So we will be working in 2019.4.1. That's a recently released LTS for 2019, which is extremely exciting, as we all know, given the stability of an LTS version. So go ahead, crack open 2019.4. Highly recommend that you do download that version. However, if you're working on any of the other 2019s or even 2020, that should be fine. I haven't checked it myself. And as we know, Unity tends to throw a few wrenches when you conflict versions. So I recommend 2019.4, but you should be okay with other versions. A few more items here. Again, we're just going to call this post-processing LL, but you can call it anything you'd like. And if you do have any questions around setup or any conceptual leaps or anything like that, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A channel. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should have that Q&A button. It's a really nice feature in Zoom, and that will help to differentiate and keep your questions separate from the chat. So the chat can just be general comments and community building, and then the Q&A will be where the rest of the guys on the team will get to the questions as soon as possible. And one last point here before we dive in. Sometimes we move quickly. Other times we move a little more slowly. The reason being is we have found, just from general feedback from attendees in past sessions, they prefer to take a look. They prefer to take a look and watch what I'm doing. And then they follow up as we work together. And then lastly, we'll create a space for you to work on this challenge by yourself. So again, first I'll work through the challenge, then we'll work through the challenge together. And then lastly, you will have a few minutes to catch up, finish up working on that challenge before we move on to the next part of the activity. So it's always the I do, we do, you do. And with that said, guys, let's go ahead and dive in. So the first step here, this is just challenge 0, foundational. Let's just go ahead and get everything in our project. So this one's a little different. I actually, I opened up the package from my desktop when I downloaded it rather than the package just being something that we can import into Unity. So you will download the project and not just a Unity package itself. You can do so on the Learn Live site and then go ahead and open it up. We're going to spend a few minutes here just making sure everybody's caught up before we dive into the next challenge. And while we're waiting for that download, let's go ahead and talk about why we're focusing on post-processing today. So post-processing, I'm seeing here post-processing for VR, that's actually another session that we're running. So if you're interested in virtual reality, definitely keep an eye on the calendar because we will have virtual reality specific workshops as well. But post-processing is a full screen filter. This is a really effective tool to boost the fidelity in all of your projects. And for the most part, most of the effects work across virtual reality, but they pretty much work across all platforms. So there's really, there's an age-old debate. Do we go with Unreal? Do we go with Unity? And the developer community is certainly behind Unity. But the common pushback is, okay, well, maybe Unity doesn't render as high fidelity. But the reality, guys, is that Unity can. And Unity's post-processing stack is a really amazing tool to add that extra level of polish, to reduce the aliasing, to make certain colors pop. And let's take a look at what I mean. Without audio, of course. So the workflow on this bottom left video, this project Neon, I believe it's called, is a really interesting, punk themed here, cyberpunk. And they actually started with the environment and the post-processing and the aesthetic first to build this mood. Within it, you can see a little bit of chromatic aberration. You can certainly see bloom, as you'll very soon understand what I mean when I say bloom, but that glow coming off of the lights. You can see there's certain emphasis on certain colors, the green, the pink, the blue, even the yellow and the orange. So how do we make those colors pop? Again, post-processing. On the far right is an automotive, which I think most people have seen. This definitely came out a few years ago, so most people have seen the automotive example. But again, how do we get such smooth edges? How do we get such a realistic aesthetic? Well, HDRP, or the high definition render pipeline, certainly helps, but post-processing is a really important ingredient to get so many of these cinematic quality effects that we see on the right. So a few examples: depth of field, motion blur, color grading. These are some effects that we'll take a look at today. But again, the videos at the bottom here represents the fidelity that we can achieve in Unity through post-processing. Cool. So hopefully everybody has downloaded the project and they have opened it up. So let's go ahead and let's jump into our first challenge. And again, I'll go through it quickly and then we will open up the space for everybody to get going. This session today is a beginner-oriented session. If you're really familiar with post-processing, these first few challenges will be pretty straightforward because we're just setting up post-processing in our project. If you are completely new to post-processing, this challenge is for you. We'll work through actually setting it up in your project, and then we will go into some of the best and most popular features. All right, so I'm going to hop over. I'm going to have a new share here. And as you can see, I have my package manager open. And before I dive into that, I just want to make sure that the chat isn't blowing up with people saying they can't hear me or something like that. All right, looks like there are no fires. Fantastic. Cool. So let's level set. So we open up the project. What do we have here? We have Unity's Courtyard scene, which is a really high fidelity asset. I mean, I think it has millions of tries in here, so it's quite expensive So this is certainly something a little out of reach for a mobile VR headset. But as you can see, a lot of the colors are, it's a little dull. We have some reflections on the bottom. And if you actually look at the hierarchy here, we'll have audio, as we can see, some effects. We have our reflections representing the water, and then we have an FPS controller. So we'll be able to move around using WASD and the space bar in our scene as well. So we'll go ahead and explore that in just a minute. But this first challenge, again, revolves around just downloading and setting up the post-processing. So go to Window, go into Package Manager, because again, if we have any of these packages that are baked into Unity but not in the project out of the box, we use the Package Manager as the tool to access any additional packages. And in this case, yes, I'm already on post-processing. Let's go ahead and download 2.3.0, which, as you can see here, is 2019.4 verified. So it works perfectly with our version. So go ahead and hit install. We'll give that a few minutes. As we're letting that run, take a quick look at the questions. All right. Of course, getting the loading wheel here. So we're letting that sit. We're just downloading all of the packages. And while we're waiting for that, let's go ahead and go back to our presentation, because this first one is just about bringing the project and then installing post-processing. Oops. So once you have post-processing downloaded, and let me take a look at that. Looks like it just downloaded, so I am ready to go. Once you have post-processing downloaded, there are really just 3 steps to get post-processing going in your project. Again, the setup is just 3 steps. First, you need to add a post-processing layer. So this is the actual entity that will hold your, that connects the camera or designates the camera as our target for the post-processing effects. So you add that layer directly onto your camera component. Then you need to create a post-processing volume. And by the way, we're going to talk about the volume workflow in just a minute. So we're going to create a post-processing volume, which is effectively a bucket that holds your post-processing profile. The post-processing profile is effectively a checklist of all of the different effects that you can implement. So we'll create that post-processing volume. And we can add that to anything. I usually add it just to an empty game object. And then I add, as you can see here, a collider onto that empty game object so that we can actually make it a quote unquote volume so you can use the volumetric workflow. And again, we'll talk about what the volumetric workflow is in just a minute. And then lastly, we'll create our actual post-processing profile, which again is that checklist. So just 3 steps, and let's go ahead and do just that. So in our second challenge, once you have imported the post-processing stack, go ahead and create an empty game object and call it post-processing volume and add the post-processing volume component to it. And remember, the post-processing layer needs to be added to the camera as well. So we'll go ahead and add that layer, and then we will add all these different effects. So I'll leave that now, and I'm going to go ahead and dive back into my project here so we can do it together. So remember, I do, you do, we do. Nope, missed that up. I do, we do, then you do. So let's go ahead and do that. So I right-click in the hierarchy, create empty, and we're going to call it just PV volume is what I promised you we'd call it. And then from there, remember, we add our volume. So add a component, type in volume, post-process volume. Awesome. And we'll talk about these in just a moment, all these different settings, but let's go ahead and finish setting it all up. And what's the next step? Well, again, we need to add that layer. Oop. Excuse me. I always do this at least one time. For those of you who have joined us in the past, I always do this one time. I always forget to reshare. So I'll start from the top there. Apologies. For those of you yelling at me in the chat, that was a test. And you passed. Just making sure everybody's paying attention. So Again, we need to set up the post-processing volume. So we have our hierarchy on the far left, right click. And let's just rename that to PP volume. Cool. Add a component. We have volume. Nice. And again, I'll repeat myself. We'll go over what these settings mean in just a minute, but let's go through the whole setup workflow before we dive into the specifics here. And then let's go to our camera. We can close that. And yes, we already have a post-processing layer on it because, believe it or not, I do go through this activity beforehand. But let's go ahead and add a new layer so you get the full workflow. Post-process layer. And already we can start to see some of the effects immediately when we add it, as you can see. So make sure that's checked on. Cool. And out of the box, we have a few interesting things here. Well, first of all, layer. What exactly is a layer? Well, we can determine which objects are actually affected by the post-processing in this case. And though this isn't very performant for all intents and purposes, we can go ahead and hit everything. So every layer in our scene will be affected. And you'll already get a warning here. It says that it slows down the volume blending process. Masks might get messed up, and then that's okay because we're just playing around with this. Though, as a side note, in every professional project we work on, we exclusively designate the layers. We never just say everything. So for your professional workflow, recommend that you find your layer. And the best practice, realistically, is to have a post-processing layer as well. But we'll leave it at everything. All right, so what else on this layer component we look at? Well, we can look at anti-aliasing. And anti-aliasing, I'll be so bold as to say, is one of the most important features because it removes all of the jaggedness that we see. And by the way, these are reflections. This is not aliasing. These are just reflections. But if we do look closely at an object, let's see if we can find an object to look at. There are a few objects here. Let's see. Excuse us for making you sick. Well, you can see it here. You can see a little bit of aliasing, say, on this pipe. So if we turn on anti-aliasing, and again, fast approximate anti-aliasing is the most popular form of anti-aliasing, giving its performance benefits as well, things smooth out. And yes, it is subtle. It is subtle, but every bit does matter. So let's again take a look at that. So you turn on that fast approximate and it smooths out. You see less jaggedness on the hard edges of all these models. Cool. The next area to keep an eye on is this fast mode. So in a few of the post-processing features, you'll see there are these parameters as dubbed as fast mode. And this is a really straightforward way to get more performance out of your application. So if you're doing a final pass, again, if you have a client project you're working on, virtual reality, augmented reality, desktop, if you're working on a client project and you're struggling with performance, specifically because of post-processing, a few of these features have this quote-unquote fast mode that you can toggle on. And that will just help you juice a little more, get a little more juice and a little more performance out of your project. So recommend if you're building to mobile, be sure to toggle on fast mode. Alpha is a transparency feature, and you can see these pop-ups as well. Anybody who's been working in Unity is very familiar with these with these hints that Unity provides, or the interface provides. So you can just hover over all of these parameters, and you can see all the hints. So given that I'm on a desktop right now, my Mac specifically, which isn't great, but it's okay, I'm going to keep fast mode off. No reason to implement that right now. Great. So what about some of the other features? How do we add some of the other features? Well, we go back to our post-processing volume. And the first thing you'll see here is global. So what is global? And I promised you that we were going to talk about the volumetric workflow, right? So what is the volumetric workflow? And what is global? Well, as it turns out, the default here is to not apply your post-processing effects globally in the entire scene until you toggle this on. So once we toggle this on, that's when our effects that we'll implement in just a moment will be added to the entire scene rather than just a volume. And when I say a volume, that refers to a collider or trigger. And if you're within that collider, imagine a box collider, then these effects will be applied. And we'll walk through that in just a minute. Cool. Priority and weight. Don't worry about these two right now. We'll play around with them in just a moment when we create additional volumes. But for now, let's go ahead and create a profile. Does everybody remember when I said that a profile is like a checklist? So if we have a profile, we will have a checklist of all the different settings that we can use. But you see in the profile parameter, we don't have anything. So let's just go ahead and hit new. And as you can see, nothing happened. So why didn't anything happen? Nothing happened because we haven't added an effect. So to add an effect, again, bloom, occlusion, chromatic aberration, lens, any of these effects, post-processing effects, you can just add effect by hitting this button. They're considered overrides, or they're called overrides. So we'll add an override, and let's start with ambient occlusion because it's a really obvious one. We can really see the effect taking place. So select ambient occlusion, and we're going to call out another gotcha once that finishes loading. So again, ambient occlusion doesn't seem to be working. Why? Because Unity wants you to be very intentional with how you're using post-processing, and they don't turn on all of these by default. They want to make sure that you're not destroying your performance just by hitting one button. So we actually need to do another step. We need to hit all. We can either hit all or we can add toggle on these different effects individually. So because it's quicker, let's go ahead and hit all so it toggles everything on at once. And then we can increase the intensity. And you can see that my screen now is getting darker. And let's go ahead and navigate to another area so we can really see that effect. And by the way, let's make our ambient occlusion blue. Let's increase our thickness. And for those who are calling out the fidelity, that's not the point. The point is just to walk through this, and then we'll start focusing on how to increase fidelity and all this. But you can see the blue taking over, right? And ambient occlusion just refers to making the parts of the scene, the corners, the cracks, the areas that should be a little darker with shadows, just a little more dark. It almost has this, this dark cloud effect. And this out of the box is included in Unreal. However, we have more flexibility by keeping it separate in Unity. So we have to do a little more work to achieve this effect, this fidelity. But again, we have more flexibility, especially because ambient occlusion can be a quite expensive trick here, or override effect, if you will. So again, you can make it any color that you'd like. You can make it red for the sake of example. And let's go ahead and take a look at a few more of these. Another great one is color grading. So, and by the way, we're going to turn this over to you in just a few minutes. But again, to finish up this example, color grading, which we have a specific workshop on. So stay tuned as well if you're interested in learning more. Color grading, as you can imagine, modifies specific colors in the scene. But it also has this really great tone mapping overview or mode feature. And let's go ahead and just kill this effect here, at least reduce it so we can see more of the effect, the tone mapping. In many commercials, in many cinematic projects as well, the team uses ACEs. So this is called filmic ACEs, and that's because it's the most popular tone mapping feature used across the cinematic world. So if we'd like to increase the fidelity and the realism of our project, go ahead and change the tone mapping mode to ACEs. And you can see that things get a little darker. Everything gets a little darker and a little more realistic. And if that's too dark for your preference, we can move down to tone. Again, I'm on the right side here. We can go tone to post exposure, and we can just crank up the exposure just a little bit. And that's just opening up the camera. That's not doing anything to the lighting in the scene. It's just opening up the camera so that it takes in more lighting from the scene. Cool. So let's review, and then I'm going to kick it over to you guys. So what have we done? Remember, the first step, we created an empty game object here, and we called it PP volume. And to PP volume, we added the post-process volume. We toggled on is global, and then we added a few effects. And also remember that we added this profile. If we look at the camera, because that's the second part, the second half of this workflow, we added the post-process layer. We made sure that the layer is set to everything because we want everything to be affected, and we turned on anti-aliasing. So I'll go ahead. I'm going to leave this screen. Actually, let me take a look at. I'm going to go back to our slide. As I take a look at the chat and as I take a look at the QA, I'm going to do a new share. So inevitably, this is the danger zone, remember. I want to make sure that this is actually sharing this time. Cool. It looks like it is. So these are the steps that we followed. Let's take just a few minutes here to go through on our own. We're going to go until 12:30 my time. I'm in Minnesota right now, so it's Central Time. We're going to go until 12:30, 4 minutes. And everybody can explore the different effects. Make sure that you can set up a baseline. Let's make sure you can set up the post-processing volume, set up the effects, and then if you have a little bit of extra time, go ahead and explore the different effects. In the meantime, I'm going to take a look at our chat and questions. So one of the questions in the chat is the position of the post-processing volume of any importance. So we're going to talk about the volumetric workflow in just a minute. Short answer is when the volume is global, no, it doesn't matter at all. But if the volume is not global, yes, it very much matters because you have to be within the volume, the collider, the trigger, in order for the effects to occur. So we'll go over that in this next example here at Rodrigo. All right, I'm taking a look at the questions. One question is, will this work in 2018.4? I am pretty sure if I had to bet, yes. I have not checked it in 2018.4. Highly recommend that you are in 2019 at minimum. In 2019.4, though there aren't any scripts or any big dependencies there. We tried to gut the project before this, so you should be fine to work in 2018.4. Dimitri's question, can you use 2 or more post-processing volumes? Yes, absolutely. Is global is the feature that you'll use or the parameter that you'll tick. If both volumes have is global answered or turned on, then you'll need to set the priority order. But we'll work through that in just a minute. All right, I'm going to circle back to the project here with just less than a minute to go, and then we'll dive in. For the rest of the questions that are still open, we will get to those in just a minute. We'll have the rest of the team follow up with you. All right, so let's keep on keeping on. So at this point, hopefully everybody had a chance to, yes, open up the project. If you didn't, scream and holler in the QA, not over the mic, of course. Hopefully everybody has downloaded the post-processing, and hopefully everybody had a chance to actually set it up. If you didn't, again, we'll be circling around to make sure that everybody made it there. So now it's time to dive a little deeper. We have ample time left, which is fantastic. So we're going to have quite a bit of time to work together and keep on exploring different effects. And we're going to do just that. We'll spend part of the time you demoing, and then other times you will be able to work on it yourself. But you can see a pretty dramatic contrast once you add some vignette and some bloom and then play the ambient occlusion and the anti-aliasing between these two. For those who need a little more explanation, yes, the left screenshot does not have any post-processing applied to it, and the right screenshot does, in fact, have post-processing applied to it. So we're going to recreate this on the right in just a moment and make sure that all the colors pop and we achieve the desired look and feel that we seek, rather than just keeping the scene relatively dull in terms of saturation. So a few of the features that we are going to dive into right now: ambient occlusion, color grading, anti-aliasing, and bloom. So the workflow here is I'll go back to the project, and we'll continue to toggle all of these on, and then we'll work through the different parameters so you have an idea of what exactly they do, and then the trade-offs as well. It's really important when you're playing with post-processing that you don't just willy-nilly add a bunch of effects. Your project will suffer in terms of performance very, very quickly. So typically less is more. Especially with a feature like bloom, you don't need to be overzealous with a feature. You can add a little bit, and a little bit goes a really long ways. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Do a new share. Let's double check, make sure it's actually sharing this time. It looks like it is. Fantastic. All right. So we're going to spend most of the time exploring these different features, but we're also going to explore the volume. So we had a few questions. When would you be able to get the volume? Or when would the volume even matter? For instance, if you toggled off is global. So right now I just toggled off is global. Toggle back on and the effects are applied. So let's make sure that we have the colors so that everything is really red when we go into this effect, like ridiculously red, heinously red. And let's go ahead and duplicate this game object. And okay, level set. What are we doing right now? We are going to work through the example of when you wouldn't use this is global. So is global should be toggled off or will be toggled off. Because this is a volumetric workflow, we're going to set up another volume that has a very specific, again, volume or collider that we'll walk through. And the moment you walk through that collider is when that set of features or effects will be implemented. So let's go ahead and duplicate this volume. Let's go ahead and create a new post-processing volume, right? This is the old volume. So let's go ahead and create a new volume. Of course, it's loading. And by the way, you guys should only have one volume in there, if any at all. So now we have a new volume that we're using with no effects in it. But let's go ahead and add some new ambient occlusion, and we're going to make it really blue or really green, whichever you're, if you have a favorite color, go ahead and just make it that favorite color. But bottom line is we're going to crank up that intensity. Shoot, we could do black if we really wanted to. In fact, I'll stay at black. But what's important here is we want to make sure that both of these effects are actually not is global, so that none of the volumes are actually going through. And let's go ahead and navigate our camera to right above the staircase. And let's grab that second volume and hit either, if you're on your Windows, Control-Shift-F. If you're on Mac like me, you can do Command-Shift-F. And that just moves the volume to where your camera was. So go ahead and move that camera over. And the next step, because we want it to be a volume, we add our collider. Again, I've been hinting at this for quite a while now, but the collider is something that we can walk through. So let's make sure that that volume is actually big enough to walk through it, but not so big that it encompasses everything. Great. And we can make sure that rotation is set. Cool. And guys, this is a pretty big volume. This is just for the sake of the example. But you can see the green box you can see this green box here. And now that my computer's about to take off with the fan, you can see the green box, and that is what we will walk through. So make sure that the box collider as well is a trigger so that you can actually walk through it when you go into play mode. So let's go ahead and hit play, and let's explore that. So I'm looking around, I'm in play mode, I can walk. And as we walk through it, yes, you can see that the ambient occlusion kicks in, and the moment we leave the box, if we can ever leave it, there we go, it disappears as well. So in just a moment, we'll talk about how that's even practical. Why is this even necessary or helpful in just a moment. But again, the takeaway here is that once I walk through that collider, the effects kick in. So let's go out of that so my computer doesn't blow up. Okay, so why does that even matter? Why is that even helpful? So the volume workflow is set up for precision workflows. Or rather, if we want to have precise effects in precisely placed, not to overuse that word, in particular areas of our level or scene. So you can imagine if, let's say, again, because I work on occupational training and many of our clients are, we work with quite a bit in healthcare. If somebody moves to a particular part of the room, say it's a surgical simulation or surgical training, if somebody moves to a particular part of the room and that's a no-fly zone, for whatever reason, they weren't supposed to go there. And this, of course, is a VR training. We could have a volume set up so everything flashes red, or there are some other indicators that this is not where you're supposed to be at this particular time. So it's another way to provide feedback. It's another feedback mechanism in that particular case, right? Another area would be a tunnel. What if you're walking through a tunnel in a level? Let's say it's a construction simulation. You're walking through a tunnel and then you move out into outside of the tunnel. And obviously the lighting is completely different. So when you're inside of the tunnel, inside of that volume, you might have a particular set of effects. And then once you leave that tunnel or that cave, that's when you have a brand new set of effects. So all of a sudden that location becomes very, very important. So the takeaway here, guys, is once you toggle is global, it's applied everywhere. And then once you keep it off, you need to have that volume in order to implement those effects. Cool. So this is quite distracting now, how intense that occlusion is. So we're going to turn that down. We can also, it is global. And yes, we do need to turn that down. Relax a little bit. And let's take a look at some of the other features. Cool. So another really interesting feature is bloom. So what does bloom mean? Let's make sure that this is global as well. Oh, I'm sorry, is global. If you have two is globals, which one, a common question is if you have two volumes and they're both is global, how do you know which one will be the priority? Well, that's why we have this priority parameter here. So we can go ahead, we can increase the priority, post-processing 1, make sure it is global. And then if it's reduced past 0, then the other one will take over as well because it's at 0. So the higher the priority, the more important it will be. If they're the same priority and they have the same effect, it will blend. The volumes will blend. But if they have the same effect, for instance, both have the ambient occlusion activated, the one that has been modified the most recently will take precedent. Cool. So let's go ahead and look at a few other features. So we're looking at bloom as well. So what I've mentioned bloom a few times. What exactly is bloom? Well, bloom is a really aesthetically pleasing effect where you can add a bit of glow to the lights in your scene. If you are walking down the street at night and you look at a post, for instance, you may notice that there's a glow around the light post. And that's the effect that bloom attempts to achieve. It creates almost this heaven look where the light becomes a little more glowy. And it's really nice and it's really expensive. So again, 9.65 is like way more than we'd ever include in any client project. But for the sake of the example, we'll go ahead and leave it. So now we have this nice idyllic heaven look. And then we have additional features that we modify. Again, remember, fast mode. This is a nice little performance boost. So we can go ahead and hit that, and that will just cut back on the bloom. We can modify the color as well. We can modify the threshold, so we can decrease it or increase it. And then down here, we have the dirtiness feature. This is one of my favorite parts of Bloom because you can add so much more filmic effects to it, or realism. For instance, they call it dirt. But if you had, say, a few smudges on your camera, for instance, and then all of a sudden, the way the light is refracting off of those smudges or those scrapes, that's what the dirt effect would be. So how that light reacts with that texture on your camera lens can be simulated with texture here. So you just add a texture, a 2D texture, an image. So let's go ahead and take a look at another one. Let's go ahead and take a look at Vignette. Vignette is another really popular effect because it's easy. It's easy to overdo, and it's a really obvious effect. And general question for the crowd: what do we all think Vignette is? Go ahead and answer it in the chat. What is Vignette? Oh, by the way, I hear you. I just had a request to turn up the volume. I'll try to speak a little closer to the mic. Yes, so yep, exactly. So the dark edges on the screen, that's exactly what it is. So we can go ahead and add that dark edge feature, the vignette, by again, adding the effect, hitting all, and we can increase the intensity, and we'll see our vision collapse. Obviously, that doesn't look very great. So that's also not supposed to look great. And we can modify the shape with roundness. So you can see that I have a rectangle view here. So if we wanted to keep the dimensions of the rectangle view, we could just modify the roundness feature and then modify the smoothness and then decrease the intensity. So we just have a subtle effect around the corners. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see a very different aesthetic appear with all of our post-processing. And yes, if we go into the game view, you'll see it as well. The camera's not placed in a great location, but you can start to see the vignette around the bottom. All right, let's take a look at a few others here. So another one that's interesting is motion blur. Motion blur is the blur upon motion or any kind of acceleration. So let's go ahead and just add it and play around with it. And you'll see that as you move your camera back and forth or move around, by adding this motion blur effect, once you hit play, you'll see a blur happen in the camera every time I move quickly or every time I accelerate. And you can imagine if you're in virtual reality, this becomes, forgot I have the big red. You can see, unless it's a little too choppy through the feed, you can see that blur taking place. That's not a lag, that is in fact post-processing effect. And let's go ahead, let's get rid of that big red. Forgot about that. All right, so we're going to leave it there. We're going to keep on playing around with this. So we have plenty of time left, but before we all hop off, I want to give you a few more resources. What typically happens in the last challenge and then the bonus challenge is some of us stay on to continue to work together and to walk through it, and then a few others, they fall off as they finish it up. So before there is a mass exodus, let's go ahead and hop back to the presentation so you can see, we can talk about next steps really quickly, and then additional resources for you to explore to really take your post-processing workflow to the next level. So we just played around Bloom, anti-aliasing, color grading, remember ACEs, and ambient occlusion. And our challenge for you is try to create a dramatic thriller or even a vintage movie effect. There is a grain effect. One of the post-processing effects is grain. And that creates a really interesting vintage movie. So see if you can find that, see if you can play around with it and create, again, that vintage movie effect. And then one of the questions that a lot of people typically have is, what about VR? Well, not all effects can actually work in VR right now, and they shouldn't. Again, motion blur will really make your user really sick. So don't worry, don't ever try to implement motion blur. Vignette is actually commonly used for locomotion. So as you're accelerating in virtual reality, you may have Vignette engage and increase in intensity as well. So collapsing the peripheral vision to avoid any kind of vestibular distortion or sickness. So that's another way. Anti-Aliasing is another effect commonly used. So if you would like to discuss further how we use post-processing, follow up with me after. Always happy to answer any questions and teach you everything I know, so we can continue the conversation there. But we will have a VR-specific workshop coming up as well eventually. So stay tuned for that, or follow up with me after. A few other bonus challenges. Well, let's make sure that you actually get the post-processing working and customized in your scene. So create multiple post-processing volumes, again, with different profiles, and see if you can use the volumetric workflow to move to different parts of your scene to engage those different effects. And once you do that, go ahead and post your results in the Connect group. And we will go ahead and we'll share the links after this as well. So coming up, how can you continue your learning? Well, the next workshop, I will be running that one as well in the next few weeks, is around particle systems. So particle systems is one of my favorite tools in Unity. We can create smoke and fire and snow as well. We can create waterfalls, which we will be creating. We can create galaxies, so stars. We can create little particulates floating around. We can create the sun. We actually will be creating the sun. So go ahead and stay tuned for the Particle Systems Challenge. Will be posted very soon. And that next will be on July 2nd. So with that said, let's hop back into our project. If you enjoyed the session, feel free to reach out. You can connect with me on LinkedIn at Tim K LinkedIn, the bit.ly link down below. But thank you all for coming, and I'm going to go back to the project to keep on working on this. So again, we'll be around for another 13 minutes here. So feel free to keep on diving in. So I'll continue to dive into the project and explore a few other effects. So I'm back in the project. Let's see, let's go ahead and simplify, 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 as I think Socrates once said. Yes, I'm that person who quotes Socrates. Let's go ahead and add a few more. So what's another effect we can play with? Lens distortion is quite interesting. Depth of field is less interesting, I find, unless we have a stationary camera creating a really interesting cinematic effect. So there is a whole cinematic suite to these workshops: timeline, cinemachine, and then cutscenes, where we combine timeline and cinemachine. So if you're interested in how to use this for cinematic effects, definitely hop into that, and we can dive in. Then we can dive into a great use of depth of field. So let's take a look at green. So again, one of the challenges here was to use the green feature so we could create more of an old school look. So let's go ahead and increase that quality or intensity. Oh yeah. And all of a sudden it looks like an older film. Again, if you're in VR, I don't recommend this necessarily, because this is just going to magnify the screen door effect. So I certainly don't recommend that you use this unless you have a desktop 3D simulation, as we do here. But you can see that we're starting to get that green look. And again, for the stream, given that there isn't a tremendous amount of resolution coming through, let's see if we can really bump it up. Great. Now you should be able to see something more. So tremendous amount of pixelation. What else can we do? We already played around with color grading. Lens distortion is interesting. So I'm going to turn down grain. Lens distortion can create a fisheye look, or it creates the opposite. So let's go ahead and play around with that a little bit. We can increase the intensity. Now we have somewhat of a fisheye, and then we have the opposite. So I find this to be pretty interesting. A while ago, we were creating a flying simulation. And as you accelerated, we found that by decreasing the intensity into the negatives here, not only could the user focus more on their target, but it created more of a flying effect. So this is dramatic. This is definitely a very dramatic way to use the distortion in this case. But again, you can imagine all the different creative ways that you can use this effect in the context of a different project. So let's go ahead. We will smooth that out a little more. Let's go ahead and increase it. So now we have a nice fisheye. Screen space reflections, this increases the precision of your reflection. We don't have any micro reflections in this project, so it's actually not as relevant. An example of this, say, is if it just rained in your scene and you just had some water on the ground and some really small puddles, this would be a really great effect to increase the reflectivity of those puddles. What else? Again, depth of field, you can target. It's effectively the manual focus feature on a camera. So you can target the depth of focus, so the focus point, or the focal point with this feature. We already used color grading, but we didn't dive too deep into color grading. Color grading is, yes, it gives you access to aces, which is great. So we can go back into aces to get that more realistic look. But you can also modify the white balance. So let's say that every time you walk into the water here, you want it to turn really red or orange. You can see that by increasing the temperature. We can modify the tint as well, so to green or to purple. We already mentioned the post-exposure to turn up the brightness a little bit. What becomes really interesting is when you go down to these color grading curves. And again, this is so outside of the scope. We're just exploring at this point. This is not a learning objective or a takeaway from the session, given that we have an entire session dedicated to the color grading workflow. But we can use the grading curves down here to target specific colors and either undersaturate or oversaturate them. So if you stick around for the color grading post-processing workshop, you'll learn how to create a Sin City effect. So you can make everything black and white, and then you can take all of the red in the scene, and you can just totally, you can just increase the intensity of that red. Yeah, these trackballs. So yeah, I mean, this is pretty much it, guys. I mean, there is quite a bit here. You can spend absolutely days and days and days, and I highly recommend that you do so. The best way to learn more about this is not to read the manual, though the manual is really, really great and thorough. But the best way is just to explore the different features. And then once you have the flavor of all the different features, that's when you can recall what each of these features might do, or at least you understand that's possible. And then you can be much more precise and really fine-tune for that specific look and feel that you're going for. Auto exposure is the last one that we'll speak to. Well, chromatic aberration, auto exposure. Chromatic aberration, again, refers to how the light is reflecting off of the camera. So sometimes you'll see different lights, or rather different, because of the light angle, it might create interesting refraction, and then you might see a little bit of red, yellow, or green, or what have you. So chromatic aberration creates that chromatic aberration effect. And auto exposure, again, let's use that cave example. You're walking out of the tunnel, you're walking out of a cave, and then that adjustment period. So all of a sudden your eyes adjust from being in a very dark place to a very light place. And that transition can be attained with auto exposure. So certainly play around with auto exposure if you're curious. And with that said, guys, we are at our mark, or just under 60 seconds here. So if you have any questions, be sure to get that in. All right. It looks like all of our questions are hit. We are right at our mark. So again, thank you all for coming. If you're interested in connecting or following up with continued conversation, feel free to reach out in email or LinkedIn. And with all that said, thank you. The next session will be in 2 weeks. Hope to see you there.